All right guys, let's go ahead and get this chain installed onto our go-kart. The first thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that our rear sprocket is in line with our front sprocket. So we want to make sure that our rear sprocket here is in line with the sprocket up here on our clutch. Hopefully you guys can see that. And another thing you'll also notice is back here I have everything loose. I've got all these screws and our sprocket loose. And this is actually a split sprocket, so there's actually two halves to the sprocket. And the key thing here is once we get this thing tanked down is that you don't want it to be slightly off, or what you'll notice when you go to check your tension is there's gonna be a tight spot on the chain, and that's what we're gonna try to avoid. And I'm gonna show you how I tighten up this sprocket to avoid that. So the first thing we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna tighten one of the middle bolts just to hold the sprocket firm up against the hub so we can get our alignment set. So what I'll do is I'll just grab my wrench and my Allen key, and I'm gonna tighten up this middle bolt. Just like that, so that my sprocket is sitting up nice and flush with my hub. And then I'll grab my chain aligner. We'll start out with the laser aligner first, and then I'll show you how to use the other aligner as well. And you're going to want to install your aligner right next to the bolt that you tightened up, just like that. And then what I'll do is I'll stand directly behind my rear sprocket, looking directly down the line in between the two sprockets, and then I'll move my hub back and forth until that laser lines right up with that front sprocket. Right there. Perfect. Okay, just like that. And then what we'll want to do is we'll want to just slightly tighten up this bolt, our hub locking bolt, ensuring we don't move anything. We'll just give this a little snug so it doesn't want to wander on us. Just like that, snug it up just a little bit so it doesn't want to wander. Let's go ahead and double check that we haven't bumped our alignment. It never hurts to double check, triple check if you need to. And we are still good. Okay, so from here what I'll do is you're gonna wanna pull your motor back all the way on your mount. So get your motor slid back. Go ahead and we'll grab our chain. We'll slide it up over front sprocket, just like that. And then we'll put it over our rear sprocket. Get the chain over the rear sprocket. And then from here what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to push my motor all the way forward and get some tension on that chain. You don't need to tighten your motor down, just make sure the motor's forward so you've got some tension. And then what I'm actually gonna do is I'm looking for where the sprocket split. And let's loosen up that bolt that we had tightened real quick before we go too far. You'll want all your bolts loose when we do this. Just loosen that up just a titch. And then what we're looking for is we're looking for where these two sprockets meet. And you're gonna wanna have that pointed straight up. So what that's gonna do is that's actually gonna have it sitting between those two links, holding them together, and you'll notice that it's doing the same thing down there on the bottom. And from here what I'll do is I'll tighten up this middle bolt of the one side of the sprocket, of one of the split sprockets. Get this tightened up real quick. And the reason I only do this single bolt is because what I'm trying to do is avoid that tight spot in the chain after we get these all tightened up. And then what I'll do is I'll just spin my axle around, wait for the split of the sprockets to be pointing straight up in between those links. And then what I'll do is I'll tighten down the center bolt of the other sprocket. Just like that. All right, and our sprocket should be pretty centered on there. And real quick, let me actually show you how to use the other chain aligner. It's basically the same thing, if you remember from the Essentials video. So what you'll do with this thing is you'll just slide it over the sprocket, just like we did the laser aligner, just like that. And then you'll actually extend the rod out the front as far as it can go. And then what you can do is you can just stand behind it like you did with the laser and just make sure that that rod and everything is lined up straight in a line from the rear sprocket to the front sprocket. It works the exact same. There's really no difference. You'll be able to get your chain aligned just as good with either tool. I just find that the laser tool is a little more convenient. Okay, now that we've got our alignment, what we can do is we can tighten down our rear hub. So just drop your Allen key or whatever tool your rear hub takes, and we're gonna wanna put some pretty good torque on this. We do not want this sliding. If you remember from the Essentials video, this is actually what was loose on me, causing our misalignment. Unfortunately, we did not throw a chain, but that was a little loose. So now that we've got that tightened up, what I like to do is I like to just jiggle my chain. And with the type of mount I have, you may have a different mount that you might have to just physically slide back and forth. But with mine, it kind of allows me to I can bounce my chain, and you'll notice my motor will come all the way back. So what I'll do is I'll kind of just jiggle my chain to the point where I feel like that's the tension that I'm gonna want. That might be a tad loose. Right there. And once I've got that tension set where I want it, what I'll do is I'll tighten down my motor mount bolts. Because what you'll notice is when you tighten down your motor mount bolts, sometimes your chain will tighten up on you. So we'll just want to get these tightened, and then we'll double check our tension to make sure we're good before we tighten down the other 4 bolts on our sprocket. And these motor mount bolts, you're definitely going to want to make sure they're tight. There's going to be a lot of torque on this motor, and you don't want your motor sliding back on your mount, which would definitely cause you to throw a chain. Okay, those are tightened. Let's just double check our tension. And like I said, I like to run a real loose chain. And for me, about that about right there is perfect. A lot of guys think that might be a little too loose, but I never throw chains. As long as you've got this thing aligned, you should be good to go. So now that we've got our motor tightened down, we've got our chain aligned, we can go ahead and finish tightening up these bolts. And there's plenty of different ways that I've seen online how guys make sure that they get these split sprockets installed so that you don't have tight spots in your chain. I've kind of come up with this way on my own, and it's real easy to do, and it's fairly consistent. I can usually get the chain and everything installed on here without too many tight spots. All right. You always want to double check that you've got all your bolts tight. All right. Double check your tension, make sure it's still good, and you'll notice that I can go all the way around and I don't have any tight spots. And that's the key with these split sprockets, is to make sure you don't have any tight spots. And what you're gonna want with 4-cycle motors is you're gonna want as much free spin as possible. So you don't want this chain too tight, or else it's not gonna have all this free spin, which is gonna allow your cart to roll a lot better when you're out on the track. And you notice without even having any tires on there, I mean, that's just got a ton of free spin to it. It's exactly what we're looking for. And we've actually got practice tomorrow, and with this particular track configuration, I've chosen to go with a 16 front. And I have, I believe, a 54 that I'm gonna start out with and practice on the rear. Yep, a 54. So that's probably gonna put me somewhere in around a 3.4 to 1 gear ratio. That's where we're gonna start. And I'll actually show you a track map here in a second and explain to you why I've actually picked the 16 front sprocket on this particular track. But yeah, go ahead, and you're gonna need to practice this. You'll get better over time. And eventually you'll be able to fly through this job, and you'll be able to get your chain on and off, and and you'll get the tension to where you want it, and it's going to be pretty easy for you. So again, make sure you're cleaning your chains in your maintenance plan, and you're going to want to find your gear ratios. Once you've got the gear ratios you like to run, make sure you put those in your race plan, and have a good time at the track. All right, guys. So if you remember, I mentioned in the last video when we were installing our chain that for this race we have this weekend, I've decided to go with the 16 tooth front sprocket. And that's simply based on the theory that if you're running a smaller front sprocket, it should give you more pull out of the turns than if you're running a larger front sprocket. There's a lot of guys that simply think a gear ratio is a gear ratio, and it doesn't matter what size of sprocket you're running. If the math lines up, the gearing should be the same. So I'm going to show you some track layouts here. And this is the layout we ran last race. And as you can see, it's a pretty flowy track. For the most part, the guys are basically on the throttle the entire time. I mean, we've obviously got some braking zones at the end of the straightaways depending on which direction we're running. And there's obviously a braking zone up here, and I think the guys tap their brakes a little bit through this turn as well. But for the most part, they're on the gas the entire time. So I decided last race I went with an 18-tooth front sprocket. And then if you look at this track that we're going to be running here this weekend, you'll notice that we've got these 4 pretty sharp turns here. It's going to be real slow through that section of the track. So my thought process is if, for example, the theory is correct and the smaller front sprocket's going to give my driver a little bit more pull out of those turns, I might as well run it. I mean, essentially a gear ratio is a gear ratio. For the first few years we ran, all I had was an 18-tooth. So whenever we ran this configuration, and we've won races on this configuration with an 18-tooth sprocket. So it's kind of something I do, you know, maybe just kind of a mental thing. I feel like I'm getting a little bit of an advantage if I do it. But that's why I've made the decision, is because this track's got these 4 tight turns. And now that we're going to be running this tight track, we're going to need to be geared somewhat higher than we normally would in order that we don't just get absolutely dominated through here. So we're going to be probably on a pretty high gear ratio. And we're probably going to be banging our rev limiter, I would imagine, somewhere in here. So the last third of this track, I would imagine that most of the carts are going to be on the rev limiter, depending either way. I think, yep, we're going counterclockwise, so we're going to be running this way. So yeah, I would imagine that we're going to be somewhere hitting our rev limiter right in here, and then it's just going to be rev limitered out through the rest of the turn there. But that's why I've chosen to go with the 16-tooth, is because of these 4 particular turns. Whether it's going to help me out or not, I guess, is kind of up for debate. But I just wanted to show you this so you guys kind of get an idea on why I've chosen that sprocket. Again, you're going to need to go out there and test these things. If you only have 1 front sprocket, just run it. More than likely you'll be just fine. But make sure that you do keep track of the gear ratios or in the sprockets that you run, so that as you develop your race plan, you can incorporate that and you've got a good starting point the next time you're going to be out of the track. So again, make sure you do document your stuff, write everything down, create your race plan, and have a good time at the track.